did you leave Afghanistan and how old were you?
I was about 10 years old, and that was back in 1988, 89.
Why did your family leave Afghanistan?
Well, it was because of the war and also the persecution of educated individuals and the whole overall situation, and also the economy was getting bad, and mostly it was war and safety.
The term mujahideen, an Arabic word meaning those who engage in jihad, has been applied to a diverse group of peoples throughout history. The term was first applied to a group of radical Islamists who opposed British rule in Afghanistan during the 19th century. The ranks largely formed from Indian sepoys who fled to Afghanistan. The word mujahideen fell out of use until the late 20th century with the start of the Cold War and the growth of Soviet influence in the Middle East. The Soviets were interested in acquiring a satellite state within the region, and their efforts to influence the country culminated in a 1973 coup that overthrew the traditional monarchy and established a communist regime. Dissenters among the traditional rural population formed the basis for the modern mujahideen, a loose coalition of insurgent groups and freedom fighters. It was because of this opposition that the government stumbled in its early days, and the Soviets decided that it was best to intervene militarily to prevent its collapse. This set the stage for the coming conflict in Afghanistan, as well as the growth of mujahideen resistance in the country, who would dedicate themselves to the fight against communism. How did you feel about what they were doing in Afghanistan?
Well, it was a kind of unconventional war. It was more retaliation against other regime coming and taking over. It was an unorthodox way of dealing with it, but that was the only way that the people knew how to deal with it, now to kind of fight for their freedom.
Day 54 in Iran, and while there has been no significant change in the hostage situation, there has been a major development in the country next door to Iran, Afghanistan, where the pro-Soviet regime has been replaced by a government even more friendly to Moscow. The takeover was accomplished after the open intervention of Soviet troops, the first time the Russians have moved militarily against another country since their tanks rolled into Prague in 1968.
On Christmas Eve, 1979, in an unprecedented military maneuver, the Soviets began to seize strategic points in Afghanistan. The urban centers fell quickly to the rapid invasion, including the capital, Kabul, and Babar Kemal was placed as a puppet leader over the nation. As the Soviet force of over 100,000 troops began to venture into the countryside, the scattered and fragmented mujahideen were spurred into action. Initially, this resistance was little more than small skirmishes by a diverse and fragmented assortment of various Islamic groups, headed by regional warlords. Faced with a larger and more organized Soviet army, however, they were gradually forced to coalesce into a unified political entity in 1981. This group was known as the Seven-Party Mujahideen Alliance, or alternatively as the Peshawar Seven. Through the formation of this coalition, they formalized Afghani resistance to the Soviet invaders, as they mounted opposition both militarily and politically. The newly unified Mujahideen continued to combat the Soviet aggressors in the countryside, fighting back using guerrilla tactics in a series of small, fierce ambushes. The Soviets responded brutally, leveling entire villages to deny safe haven to the Mujahideen rebels, even resorting to the use of chemical weaponry. Despite this, the Mujahideen were able to recuperate and stand against the Russians with the help of some new friends. The United States had begun to take notice of the ever-growing conflict and began to arm and fund the disunified fighters. With additional funding from global powers like China, Saudi Arabia, and the United Kingdom, weapons, and motivated by the hatred of common enemy, the Mujahideen began to grow rapidly into a force to be reckoned with. The Mujahideen finally had the means and motives to challenge a global superpower. Furthermore, the United Nations formally called for Soviet withdrawal in 1982, indicating the growing unpopularity of the conflict. Backed by popular opinion and fresh troops from Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and a number of sympathetic Islamic states, the Mujahideen drew what might have been a rapid takeover into a lengthy and costly war for the Soviet aggressors. Integral to their success was Operation Cyclone, the American effort to arm the rebels in 1986, notably with the new American Stinger missile. Equipped with this deadly weapon, the tides of war began to change. Soviet gunships fell from the sky, limiting the capacity of the Russian ground troops to fight the spontaneous and unpredictable Mujahideen assaults.
Do you think what the Afghans did was right?
I think so. They did their best under circumstances to keep their freedom and also keep their religion and do what was good for them and their families at the moment. As I said, it was unconventional warfare. It was a very unorthodox manner that they did it. But anybody would do the same type of thing when their freedom and their livelihood is threatened.
Товарищи бойцы, командиры и политработники, вы честно выполнили воинский долг на земле Афганистана.
Many of the tactics the Mujahideen employed in their fight for independence were controversial and dangerous. Numerous sabotages and bombings were performed by the rebels, including the bombing of power lines, communication centers, and radio broadcast stations, in order to weaken the Soviets and crush their morale, consequently wreaking havoc on Afghanistan's infrastructure. However, the attacks also endangered non-Soviet citizens in the country. Hotels and theaters were bombed along with Soviet installations, and the loss of life on both sides was heavy. In spite of this, the fighters' efforts were largely successful. The Mujahideen were rapidly gaining ground in their efforts to repel the foreign invaders. The Soviets began to break as casualties climbed into the tens of thousands, and the global community became increasingly hostile to the Soviet efforts. Only a few years after Gorbachev came to power in 1985 and promised an end to the war, he made good on his promise. In 1988, the Geneva Accords were signed between Pakistan, Afghanistan, the United States, and the Soviet Union, signaling a final victory for the rebel forces. With the departure of the last Soviet troops from Afghanistan in 1989, the mission of the Mujahideen was complete. The war in Afghanistan was notable because it lacked a real winner and had consequences that shaped the world for years to come. The failure of the Soviets sowed the seeds of their destruction, and the Soviet Union collapsed only 2 years later in 1991. The war also ravaged the nation, and without a war to fight, the Mujahideen collapsed into anarchy and civil war. At the war's end, over 1 million Afghans had died in the 10-year struggle, only a tenth of which were non-civilians. While the United States assisted the Mujahideen in their stand against Soviet aggression through extensive donations, many of the funds and weapons they received later supported the rise of the Taliban, which at the time was a small upstart group seeking to restore order to the chaotic nation. Furthermore, among the troops sent by the Saudis to Afghanistan was a young officer by the name of Osama bin Laden, who would be inspired by the war and go on to found Al-Qaeda. Regardless of their controversial and often inhumane tactics, however, these freedom fighters truly took a stand for what they believed in. They lived in poverty and constant fear of Soviet chemical weapons, fighting without sleep and often without food for their nation. They believed in a cause, the cause of all Afghans, to free Afghanistan from the Soviets and maintain their independence. For their commitment and their ruthless determination, the Mujahideen deserve to go down as people who truly took a stand in history.
War is not a good thing. It doesn't have any good points to it. But they're doing their best to preserve their ideology and also their freedom.